Ontario seems poised to move on its commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, with talk of carbon taxes, cap and trade, and carbon pricing circulating broadly around Queen's Park these days. Joining us now to help analyze the options in the nation's capital, Elizabeth DeMarco, senior partner with Zizzo Allen DeMarco LLP, and Nicholas Rivers, Canada Research Chair in Climate and Energy Policy at the University of Ottawa. And with us here in studio, Candice Malcolm, Ontario Director with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and a Fellow with the Canadian Defence and Foreign Affairs Institute. And I'm happy to welcome our two guests in Ottawa, and Candice, you here in Toronto, all rookies on this program, first-timers. So thank you all very much for joining us here. Nick, let's just start with the basics, please. When a government says it is looking to act on quote-unquote carbon pricing, what exactly does that mean?
It means it's going to put a price on carbon emissions. And so it has two general options for doing that. It can use a cap and trade system. This is an implicit way of putting a price on carbon emissions. So it creates a certain amount of allowances. An allowance is required for a firm or a household to emit a ton of greenhouse gases. Those allowances obtain a value in the market, and that's the price on carbon. So if you want to emit a ton of carbon as a firm, you have to hold an allowance. That allowance has a price, and that's the price on carbon. A carbon tax is a direct way of putting a price on carbon. In this case, government explicitly sets the price on carbon, and every time you put a ton of carbon out into the atmosphere, you pay that tax. And so these can be, roughly equivalent systems. They both put a price on carbon, and they both, as a result, end up encouraging firms and encouraging individuals to reduce their carbon emissions because emitting all of a sudden became more expensive.
And Elizabeth, again, just going back to the basics here, why would a government want to put a price on carbon to begin with?
I think there are two main reasons. First of all, they're very interested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is critical in a carbon-constrained world. And secondly, they want to ensure that their goods and services aren't being prejudiced by neighboring carbon border tax adjustments. So certainly they want to ensure that they remain competitive in an increasingly climate-conscious world that is putting a price on carbon.
And can I infer that you are in favor of doing such a thing?
I'm certainly in favor of carbon pricing, and I'd like to task the media with maybe not seeing as much of a distinction between a tax or a cap and trade system and worrying more about the details of how the program is created and implemented.
Okay, understood. And Nicholas, again, same question to you. Do I infer that you are also in favor of putting a price on carbon?
Absolutely, and my caveat would have been exactly the same as Elizabeth's. I think that these systems can work nearly identically if they're designed nearly identically, and they can work very differently if they're designed differently. So all of the nuance is in the details of how these policies are designed. Whether they cover all the sectors or whether they cover just a subset of the sectors, whether they have a high price or a low price, what they do with the revenue that's raised from these carbon pricing mechanisms, whether they return it to emitters or whether they return it to, say, certain households, or whether they use it to cut taxes, whether they use it to invest in green goods. These are the design decisions around carbon pricing that really influence the effectiveness and the efficiency of the programs, more so than the choice between cap and trade and carbon tax.
Okay, so we now know what it is. We now know why governments may want to do it. Candice, that takes me to you. What's your view on it?
Well, I think that whenever we're going to implement a broad-based policy that has effects throughout the economy, we should be incredibly skeptical. We should be cautious, consider not only the foreseen unintended or foreseen consequences of implementing this kind of a tax or pricing scheme, but also the unforeseen, potentially adverse consequences, particularly to the economy, how it will affect economic growth, how it will affect households, particularly low-income households and folks that already struggle to make ends meet. When you're talking about imposing this kind of a broad tax, we should certainly be conscious of all of the different consequences throughout the economy, and as well as balancing that with a look at carbon emissions and how effective these kinds of taxes and schemes have worked in other jurisdictions. Have they actually produced the optimal outcome that we've intended, or has something else happened? And I think that when you look at it a little bit more broadly, you see that these kind of policies haven't actually lived up to what we've been promised that they're going to deliver.
Well, let me follow up on that. Have you looked at other jurisdictions that have brought in this kind of a new idea for putting a price on carbon, and have there been consequences that were unforeseen that you think, with the benefit of hindsight, ought not to have happened?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can look at Australia. They brought in a carbon tax and it was repealed. It was incredibly unpopular. People didn't like it. They didn't have a feeling that it was actually helping reduce carbon emissions in Australia. They just felt that they were being handcuffed and that given other efforts around the world, their efforts were futile. The recent Australian government was brought in on a campaign solely. One of the prime promises of that campaign was to eliminate the carbon tax, and they did. Typical family in Australia saves $500. We can also look at British Columbia, who brought in a carbon tax in 2008. Now, there's been a couple of different studies looking at carbon emissions in British Columbia. Research that I've seen out of the University of Northern British Columbia shows that British Columbia actually hasn't reduced carbon emissions as fast as the rest of Canada. And so I think that there are a couple of problems with the carbon tax in real life in that it doesn't actually reduce emissions in the way that it claims that it should.
Let me go to Elizabeth on that then. Do you agree that there are problems of unforeseen consequences and that putting a price on carbon doesn't actually achieve what you just said it ought to achieve, namely a reduction in the pollution that's caused?
I wouldn't agree that that's uniformly the case. I would say that the devil is in the detail and design does matter. But Steve, what you really have to look at as well, and I think a lot of the climate skeptics of the world are very reticent to look at, is the costs of inaction. So do you really want to subject Canadian goods and services leaving the jurisdiction to carbon border tax adjustments from the likes of the US, from China, and from other jurisdictions that are clearly designing systems that have that in them?
And what's the answer to that?
Absolutely not. Let's look at what target we want to achieve, first of all. Secondly, what is the most efficient, and certainly I'll give Canada's efficient, we want an efficient and effective system. And then finally, what are the costs of inaction if we don't implement something? So those are the three parameters we really want to drive home in designing a smart carbon system, pricing system. And what we also want to do is realize that in any system, it's never perfect in initial design. So design it to be reevaluated on an iterative basis. And no, we're not going to get everything perfect in the first instance. And much like Alberta has done, which has been very effective, much like Quebec has done, which is becoming very effective, and the EU has done, which was effective in its first instance and continues to be a price driver, design it to be revisited on a regular basis.
Nicholas, I take all that. However, I imagine not just the design, but who does the designing is also important here. And by that I mean there are governments which have records on taxation that some people find to be unsupportable. And if a government were to come forward pledging, let's say, to put a price on carbon, a government, for example, that might have already promised once or twice or three times in the past not to raise taxes and then done so, is that part of the issue here in terms of getting public buy-in?
I think there's no question that public buy-in is a tough sell on any of these carbon pricing schemes. The carbon is itself, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, has proven to be one of the thorniest problems the world has ever attempted to tackle. And so I think that there's no question that these are tough policies to pass. I think there's also no question, virtually no question, that these are the right policies to pass. For example, the World Bank and the IMF, a major poll of the top economists in the US, all come out to the same conclusion. The best way to reduce carbon emissions, the cheapest way to reduce carbon emissions, is to put a price on carbon emissions. Having
said that, now, Candace, I perhaps wasn't terribly well disguising who I was talking about in the last question, but the fact is the provincial Liberals in Ontario on numerous occasions promised not to raise taxes and then did so. And they may say, as they bring forward an idea here, don't worry anybody, it's going to be revenue neutral, it's not going to cost you anything extra at the end of the day, it's going to cost polluters more, but if you don't pollute, you're fine. Do they have the credibility to bring forward that argument?
No, I don't think they do. I think that the government, Premier Wynne herself, during the last campaign, first said that she would not raise taxes on the middle class. Then later in the campaign said explicitly that they would not, that it was not part of her plan, her government's plan to bring in a carbon tax. So I don't think you can run an election and win an election promising the people not to increase taxes. And then as soon as you find a perhaps politically feasible way through a carbon tax, which, as Nick said, has a lot of support from international organizations and various elites saying that it's okay to implement this tax, I don't think that's fair to the public who voted for this government on the basis of not bringing in taxes. And I think the government will have a credibility problem. They also have a track record problem. They've implemented a green energy plan over the last 10 years that's led to more than doubling the cost of electricity and hydro in this province.
In fairness, I'm not sure you can lay all that at the ground of the green energy plan. I mean, there was a massive amount of infrastructure improvement that needed to be made, and
Sure.
and part of that is in the price of electricity these days too.
Sure, but they also have a lot of a mess on their hands when we're talking about bringing in some of these subsidized green energy, the need for the gas plants. We all know what happened when they canceled those. I think that generally on this file, the government does face a little bit of a credibility issue, and then on top of that, to try to impose a carbon tax after campaigning on the exact opposite, I think that's problematic, and I don't think it's fair to the people of Ontario.
Well, again, just to be really specific about it, they didn't actually promise not to bring in a carbon tax. They said we don't have any plans to bring in a carbon tax. You may say it's just fudging a bit with the language here, but they did not specifically say they would never do it.
Well, fair enough, but they also said that they were not going to raise taxes on the middle class. Now, a carbon tax would be felt by everybody, including the middle class. And when we talk about revenue neutral tax, the way that they do with British Columbia's carbon tax, that's revenue neutral for the government. It's not necessarily revenue neutral for every taxpayer. Certain groups will, in fact, pay more. In British Columbia, farmers are paying thousands and thousands of dollars more in taxes.
If you pollute more, should you pay more?
Well, that's the concept, is that you're going to put a price on polluting.
So is that fair?
Certainly some people will pay more. So you can't really say that it's completely revenue neutral.
On every person, sure.
It's impossible.
Elizabeth, help me out with this here, because while Premier Wynne, when she did run for election back in 2013, she didn't explicitly say, under no circumstances will I ever bring in a carbon tax. She said it's not part of our plan, and it wasn't part of her plan, so that was accurate. But clearly she was not embracing the idea, and she clearly is now. Some kind of price on carbon. What do you think changed?
So let me drive you back to that initial distinction. I think there's a big difference between a tax and a price on carbon, and the discussion that you've been having with Candace presumes that you're going to have a straight, pure tax. And honestly, Steve, I've been in this business for a long time. I have never seen a jurisdiction bring in a straight, pure carbon tax. Even BC has a carbon neutral government regulation to support that type of emission reduction that needs to be achieved, and the results were that it was revenue neutral, and in fact was a tax savings by the most recent analysis. So in terms of Premier Wynne coming forward, she did promise to take action on climate change and the environment, and looking at carbon pricing, including a cap and trade scheme, or the continuum of measures that you can implement to affect real cost-effective emission reductions, I think is exactly consistent with what she's been saying over the years.
In fact, Nicholas, we sort of do have a carbon tax in place already in Ontario, insofar as every time you go to the pumps and put gas in your car or your truck, there are extra taxes on that liter of gas that go straight to government, and it's a tax on gas, it's a tax on carbon. My question is, given that the price of gas is sinking like a stone these days, do you think there is some, there's a window or there's some political cover in there for a government to actually raise the tax even higher on gas, namely a tax on pollution or a tax on carbon?
Yeah, I would say two things. First of all, there are taxes on gasoline. There's excise taxes, both at the provincial and federal level, and there's sales taxes. And so those that drive a wedge between the wholesale price of gasoline and the retail price of gasoline that we pay at the pumps. Having said that, though, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that gasoline taxes, if they want to reflect the social costs of gasoline, the costs of air pollution, the cost of congestion, the cost of accidents, should be higher than they are today. And one of those costs, one of those social costs, is the cost of greenhouse gas emissions. The second thing I would say is that looking back at the BC experience is maybe something we could gain here, something we could learn here. As Elizabeth mentioned, the BC tax is actually revenue negative. In other words, the amount of revenue that's brought in from the carbon tax is more than offset by tax cuts and rebates to households. And perhaps to alleviate some of Candace's concerns, some of those rebates to households are especially targeted at groups that otherwise might have been losers as a result of this policy. And so there were rebates given to households that live in rural areas and northern areas of British Columbia to recognize their increased dependence on long travel in vehicles and potentially increased heating costs. There were also rebates given to low-income households to offset the fact that they consume a larger portion of their income in fuel. And so those kind of rebates that accompany the tax and also the other tax measures that accompany the tax try to make the households that are potentially affected by the tax whole again. They try to offset some of these concerns about distributional impacts or about revenue impacts that Candace expressed.
Well, let me go to Candace with that. You like tax cuts, right? As a person who opines on tax policy, you like tax cuts. The price of gas has gone through the floor. In some respects, families have kind of realized a $1,000 tax break they didn't expect to get a year ago. Do you think that provides government with some wiggle room to raise the tax on gasoline, which is a kind of a tax on pollution or a tax on carbon?
Well, I think that they might think that they have an opportunity because folks won't notice. You know, gas prices are low, so they have more money in their pocket. They might not notice that the government's actually increasing the taxes. But when you look at Ontario's economic forecast and the outlook, things are projected to look a little bit better because of the lower dollar, because of our increased money in our pockets from less gas.
So don't mess with that.
And I think that if you're going to impose tax, you get rid of the opportunity for Ontario's economy to grow and recover. I don't think it's a good time, and we all know that eventually the price of oil will recover. Things will get more expensive, and then at that point, people will really be squeezed. They'll have a lot less money in their pockets to make the kind of decisions.
You could lower the tax on gas at that point. If it goes up to $100 a barrel again, you could lower it again, couldn't you? The tax?
Well, I mean, sure, if we want to just be sort of micromanaging every turn, but I think bringing in this kind of a tax, we should be aware that the gasoline taxes, as Nicholas was mentioning, with provincial, federal excess tax, HST on top of those, it's already about 30% of what we pay. So, I mean, how much more really can we increase it? And again, how will that affect everything, not just the cost of transportation and gasoline, but other things like the cost of heating homes, the cost of buying food, anything that's transported. I think there's a lot of effects throughout the economy we should consider.
I wasn't with you when you read in the newspaper that Preston Manning was now in favor of putting a price on carbon, but I wish I were, because I'd love to have seen the steam probably coming out of your ears when you read it. What did you think when you read that?
Oh, well, you know, I think that this is an idea that some people can get behind, the idea of putting a price on an externality, a negative externality, and I'm sure Preston Manning thinks in theory this works great. I don't agree with Preston on how this acts in the real world. You know, we can design these eloquent theories and models, you know, in university settings. When we implement them in the real world, the effects that they have on everyday people, on our daily lives, and on the economy as a whole, I don't agree with Preston that it's a good idea to implement this kind of a tax.
Elizabeth, when somebody like the former leader of the Reform Party, the founder of the Reform Party of Canada, comes forward and says it's time to put a price on carbon, how significant do you think that is?
I think it's very significant, and even more significant is when you have industry coming forward saying, please put a tax or a price more specifically on carbon, and do that either through a cap and trade system that works for our sector or some other measure that works for our sector. Right now we have the tail wagging the dog in the system, and it's time to be responsive to it before we get it imposed upon us from neighboring trade jurisdictions. And in particular in Ontario, you don't need to presume that it will take the form of a tax. Certainly if you take a look at the top 3 emitting sectors in the province, we have transportation at about 34%, we have industry at about 30%, and we have buildings at about 17%. You can get about 81% of the Ontario economy by a smart, focused system that is somewhere along the continuum of a tax and cap and trade. And certainly that's what we should be aiming for. Smart, effective, efficient measures to reduce carbon.
And if you do all that, and it's well designed, where does the revenue that comes in, where does it go?
Certainly, revenue neutrality is a very important goal if it takes the form of a tax. If it takes the form of a cap and trade system, There are emissions intense, trade exposed sectors that you need to look at in terms of revenue to make sure we're equally competitive and not putting Canadian industry at a disadvantage. Similarly, one of the beauties of a cap and trade system is you'll never, in a tax system, see people saying, I want to pay more than the tax that's required of me. But in cap and trade, there's an economic incentive to actually reduce emissions more than what is required because it's economically efficient to do so. So you see that revenue going back into the province, into the sector in other forms. So there's a number of ways that you can look at designing smart policy to recycle the revenue in a way that is ultimately beneficial to the taxpayer. And that's what you forego if we at this point put our head in the sand and say, no, we will not take action on carbon pricing in the province.
Candace, if it could be demonstrated that the tax were, or whatever it is, the price on carbon could be smart, efficient, without adverse consequences that are of concerning to you, that it was revenue neutral, it wasn't a tax grab in disguise, could you support it?
Well, I think that even within that question, there's a lot of uncertainties, and we can't ever prove that the system will be able to, smartly navigate and read the economy. There's always going to be any government policy, anything is going to have adverse and unintended consequences that will affect everybody. We know very well in Ontario, the government is in no fiscal position whatsoever to provide any kind of tax breaks. They have a $12.5 billion deficit, debt approaching $300 billion. This is not a government that's going to be able to turn around and hand out money back to people. This is a government looking for revenue. So as far as the government of Ontario implementing a carbon tax, I would say it's a tax grab. It's an opportunity for them to help fund their government coffers. And that, no, it wouldn't be a good policy. It wouldn't be fair for the people of Ontario.
In our last few minutes here, since I know that every member of the Ontario Cabinet, every member of the civil service, every member of the Premier's staff watches this program, we're going to take advantage of that and have you all offer some advice. Nicholas, what should the Government of Ontario bring forward?
I think the government should aim to bring forward either a cap and trade or a carbon tax system that's designed in the most transparent and simple way possible, that covers all the sectors of the economy, and that aims to promote the competitiveness of Ontario firms in so doing.
You say either or. You don't have a preference as to which style you bring forward?
Like we open with, I think both of these systems can be effective, and the devil's in the details, not in the semantics of cap and trade or carbon tax.
Have you discovered over the years that one is easier to sell, politically speaking, than the other?
It certainly looks like cap and trade is easier to sell, and I think part of the reason it's easier to sell is because it's less transparent. And so you have a trade-off between the transparency of a carbon tax and the kind of hidden nature of a cap and trade system.
Maybe easier to sell because I think nobody understands really what it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Elizabeth DeMarco, how about you? What ought the Government of Ontario to do?
I'm going to extend the question to what ought to the Government of Ontario and the media do in this instance. And I think we need to stop fighting about the distinction about tax versus cap and trade and simply put a price on carbon in a way that works effectively and efficiently to target those three main sources of emissions: transportation, industry, and buildings. And once we do that, call it what you want, Steve, we'll be competitive and we'll give our businesses a leg up and enhance innovation in the province.
Well, I guess we in the media can call it whatever we want, but it's actually government that gets to decide what it's actually going to do. You don't have a preference as to which particular style they go for?
I think certainly in the Ontario context at this point, given the three top emitting sectors, it's more conducive to the cap and trade end of the continuum, but certainly there may be complementary measures that look like a tax as well. So you need to look at the whole picture and not worry so much about the labels.
This is, of course, a majority government that just got elected last June, so they're not even through their first year yet. Again, looking at the political calendar, how much time do you think they're entitled before they bring something forward and before they have something passed and into law?
Certainly my experience in every jurisdiction where we've seen carbon measures implemented is to do it quickly. It's like pulling off a Band-Aid. Alberta took about 8 months from the conceptualization of the policy to the implementation and passage of the law. Certainly Quebec moved quite quickly to adhere to a linkage with California. So I would say certainly within the next 12 to 18 months you'd want to see something done quite quickly.
You're saying within 12 or 18 months you could have something introduced and passed?
I think it's likely. I think currently the Environmental Protection Act gives the legislative authority to pass regulations in order to implement something of that nature, so they could take full advantage of that and move quickly.
Okay. Candace, last word to you on this. What do you think the government of Ontario should do?
Sure. So just two things. The first one is that the point of a carbon tax or a carbon price is to artificially increase the price and reduce consumption. But at the same time, the government of Ontario also subsidizes the production and the creation of automobiles and cars, which goes to producing fossil fuels that we burn when we drive those cars. So if the government really wants to have a broad strategy of reducing carbon emissions, they should stop by ending subsidies to the automobile manufacturing industry and corporate welfare. My second point.
Or only subsidize battery-powered cars.
Oh, sure, or you know, just let those innovate on their own. But the other point is that Premier Wynne made a promise. She made a pledge to the people of Ontario. She told us that it was not part of her plan to bring in carbon tax, and I think that the Premier should follow her word, and she shouldn't impose new taxes on the people of Ontario.
Understood. My thanks to all three of you for coming in and sharing your views on this issue today. Elizabeth DeMarco and Nicholas Rivers in our Ottawa studio. Candace Malcolm here in Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.